very happy to welcome Anthony Macri, or Macri. I'm going to try to figure out if either are right. Head of Commercial the US at BWT Alpine F1 Team. Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Sean. And the second one was right. It's Macri. So
Macri.
You were 50-50. You got it right.
Exactly. Australians always, we would probably just call you Macca in the end. We'll always shorten it or change it around. So, Anthony, I always ask people on my first question of the podcast is how people got started in the world of sports. What about yourself? How did you get into the world of sports business?
Yeah, really a pleasure to be here and happy to chat a little bit around where I got to hear from and what we're planning on doing in the future. My path into sports business was a little bit non-traditional and really started I guess ultimately, way back when, I did not study sports. I did not study business. I had nothing to do with any of those pursuits when I was back in my academic career. I actually have a double major in philosophy and theology, a minor in political science. I thought I might go into law. I thought I might go into politics. Ended up that my life took me in a direction that finished a master's degree in systematic theology and then taught religion. But really, what brought me there was coaching high school basketball. And that was something I had done. I played basketball through my life and ended up more on the sporting side and coached a couple of high school basketball teams here in the U.S. to pretty significant results, top 25 in the country for a few different years with a few different teams. And what I really uncovered during that period was while I enjoyed the wins and losses, what I really liked was developing people. And these were young men trying to help them to get to where they wanted to go with basketball. And that took me to a new job after 5 years coaching at a small Catholic school just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I went to a new role at IMG Academy, which you may or may not be familiar with, down in Bradenton, Florida. Produces a lot of top athletes, particularly in the tennis and golf space. Nick Bollettieri being kind of like the named, kind of tennis instructor to the stars that was there for a number of years. And I ran business operations for the basketball academy there at IMG.
That's really... one, I am familiar with the IMG Academy. Currently, the NFL has an international pathway program training camp down there. There's a couple of Australians, Patrick Murtagh and Jotham Russell, that are out there right now as we're recording. I'm always interested in what you studied and how you got there. And for some people, you did a lot of work around religion. Sport is religion. When you're trying to do some similarities, the passion behind it and the fervor. So you sort of started getting interested in what sport could offer, and then that first role in IMG Academy in that business sales, that sort of started opening the door of the business side of sport for you?
Yeah, functionally, my role was kind of twofold. It had two different really aims. First, on the court, I was doing professional development or basketball development, really, for the pro, college, and pre-draft players. So really focused on the high-end players at IMG, working alongside Coach David Thorpe, who some folks will know from used to be a writer on ESPN, worked with True Hoop, is one of the most well-known NBA trainers in the business. So I was working alongside him and got to learn a lot from him. That was my on-court role. My off-court role was really like the day job. That was where my job was to build out a marketing plan, a business plan to secure full-time student athletes at IMG. And they had really never had someone in that role. They'd kind of just taken whoever came. And instead, this was a real active role to go out into both the U.S. marketplace and a global marketplace, identify potential athletes and get them to commit to us and pay what amounted to a full tuition of somewhere between, depending upon the level and whether they were full-time students, somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 a year. And so we were pretty aggressive in going out there and finding them. It was really my first sales job, like official sales job. Previous role when I was at the school and I was coaching basketball, I did some recruiting. And what we found, and even in the high school level, recruiting and sales are not altogether that different. And you're really trying to solve the problem for in the case of the recruit, solve the problem for the family. They want to use basketball to help them get to college. We had a pathway that could help them to do that. And now at IMG, doing very much the same thing and really focused on bringing those students in. And I spent 2 years there. It was really I think of it this way. If my degrees previous to actually getting to sports business were theology and philosophy and political science, my degree at IMG was in sales and marketing. That was my my 2-year experience of trying to figure that out. And we had some success, and thankfully we're able to build a foundation, still continuing today for the basketball academy down at IMG. But time, it changed in a number of different ways, some good and some bad. And my family ultimately, really, quite frankly, we're not huge fans of living in Florida, and wanted to make a move. My wife wanted to be back close to the family in the Mid-Atlantic, and so we moved up into the DC area, and I got connected while I was at IMG with a gentleman who had put together investment group to purchase professional sports teams.
Okay.
And one of the investment groups that he put together was the Philadelphia 76ers, and that was when Josh Harris and David Blitzer bought that franchise at that point. And one of the minority investors in the Philadelphia 76ers was an Indonesian billionaire named Eric Thohir, who you may be familiar with, obviously invests a lot.
Kiati has been on the podcast, who works with Eric. So that just shows the small business world that it is.
It is. And so Eric owned a professional basketball league there in Southeast Asia. They had just started it a year prior. And he went to the gentleman that I had met and said, hey, do you know anyone who might be able to help us to kind of set this league up right commercially, because we think we got off on the wrong foot. We think we made some missteps, and we really need to fix it. And I had a conversation with Eric. I flew to Indonesia, did a 10-day whirlwind tour, flying from Indonesia, Malaysia, went over to Singapore for a little bit and a few other spots. And at the end of the 10 days, Eric, who I kind of gone over there to consult to the league, Eric said, look, I don't want you to consult to the league. Would you run it? And I was asked to become the CEO and commissioner of the ASEAN Basketball League. 8 teams in 6 countries, and island hopping mentioned, obviously. They had teams in Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Thankfully, we were able to kind of build out relationships that led to eventual franchises in Hong Kong and Taiwan down the road. But the first order of business was resetting the league foundation, redoing a media rights deal, ended up rewriting the league's constitution.
Okay.
It had kind of gone with a pretty traditional promoter model where Eric owned the league and the teams participated in it. And he knew, I think, from his experience in American sports in particular, that a model where the teams were really the stakeholders of the league would have a lot more longevity, a lot more staying power. And so we rewrote the league's constitution accordingly. And
were you then also part of, I guess, building up that franchise model, like giving the teams more control and equity in what they had? Yeah, I mean, we've seen something similar here in the NBL with Larry Kesselman taking over the league, but then getting more franchises involved, getting more equity. But then he's been also running some teams and facilitating the sale. But that piece of getting and it's a balancing act as a league too. You want to grow the league, but then you also need good partners, and that's what the teams are. How was that? That process of, because it's not just rewriting the constitution of the league. You actually need people coming in and sort of buying in. How was that process?
Well, functionally, when you're a commissioner of a league, and obviously I don't want to compare myself to the great commissioners that come along, but the job is not altogether that different. The team owners are your boss, but they also have interests, right? And what we found was, going in, one of the observations we made before even really getting started was that the league interests and the team interests were not aligned.
Yeah.
The league wanted to do certain things, the teams wanted to do certain things. And when that's the case, you have such a conflict constantly. There's just a battle over who's going to win at what and at what cost. And once we kind of described that if we could move in a direction where it would be beneficial for the teams and the league to have aligned interests, where we're focused as a league on certain regional things, regional television rights, regional sports sponsorships, that really ended up being more beneficial to the team. If we were focused on and making sure that there was a fair and equitable sense of play, that we were monitoring for things like match fixing and other pieces, that we were helping the teams to secure local partners and local TV rights opportunities, local broadcast media rights. Once they recognized that it was, and I guess quite frankly, once the league recognized that its role is to support the teams, and that the teams can't function without a league, there's a symbiotic relationship, it becomes easier. Now, easy is relative, because you still have, in the case of the ASEAN League, and these guys are still friends, but a few in each country, a set of a couple, one or two or three millionaire, billionaire owners investing in what is really a niche sport in most of these countries. They know they're not getting in it to make a lot of money. They're actually getting in it knowing they're going to lose money, but doing it to support the sport in the country to support their local communities, and in some cases, they aligned their businesses with the teams that they were sponsoring. So, Ruben Nangalanam in Malaysia was a part owner in the Malaysia Dragons, and the name of the team is the Westports Malaysia Dragons, and his family owned Westports, owned the Port of Malaysia.
Yeah.
So, pretty common kind of dynamic there. And once they recognized that we were trying to build a structure where the interests were aligned and everyone had something to gain from one another's success, that we were partners off the court and competitors on the court, that made a huge difference in kind of securing buy-in.
A lot of similarities and triggering for me. When I owned an esports team, we were in that same battle of trying to get all the team owners put aside the competitive tensions of fighting and either on the court or on the field to that rising tides lift all boats. You need the strong teams pulling hard, but the teams at the bottom need to be pulling their weight as well. But then also, you're right, that alignment. And I think, in our case, in the esports league, we went through a league being dissolved and rebuilding the league with a new promoter. So we had really strong ties with the teams, but getting that alignment of what the league's tried to do and what it serves well, and then how the teams are participating. Like that's the balance and success of the best leagues in the world, whether it be, NFL, NBA, La Liga, Premier League. It's getting that, what does the league do well, and what the teams do well. So it must have been both a baptism of fire, but also an amazing, broad experience to go from where you were to, in that commissioner's role with that really, wide remit.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, like I said, if IMG was my master's degree in sales and marketing, my time in Asia was that master's degree in international business and finance, and that was it was a different experience because you're talking about valuations, you're thinking through due diligence and how do we bring a new team on and what's their financial model and how can we help them to secure financing and that kind of thing. It was a different, certainly a far cry from getting a degree in philosophy and theology. And I'd made a 2-year commitment to Eric that I would be there for 2 years. My family stayed in the United States while I was in Asia, so I had a 24-hour commute every 4 months or so to come back and see. I had 2 little kids at the time. My wife stayed in the DC area, and so it was tough. We were using Skype before it became popular with the pandemic. That was a big part of our daily existence. But I was putting a lot of miles traveling around Southeast Asia. A lot of flights on Air Asia, which was our title sponsor there for the ASEAN Basketball League, and really enjoyed it. It was a cultural eye-opener. It was definitely different living in Indonesia. We're based in Jakarta, a country that's predominantly Islamic and certainly different from where I grew up, but great people. You have to like rice. The food was great. Loved that part. Unfortunately, and it's funny, I look back at that time and things that I didn't think were important then that I wish I had done now. I really didn't spend a lot of time vacationing or visiting different places other than for work. Because when I had time off, I wanted to go home and see my family back in the States. So, I didn't get down to Australia as an example. Like I didn't get to places like that. And now I kind of miss it. But hopefully with the new gig, we'll be able to take some of those opportunities, even if I do them during work. So we'll look forward to that.
Well, amazing. Like just the fact that, the connections from a guest point of view with Kiardi and Eric and the 1 degree of separation from this conversation is amazing. So you were there for 2 years and, kudos, because you're right, that is a tough commute, missing some really important time with your kids. So obviously the pull to come back to the States, it was, definitely there after that 2 years. Was it, how did you go about finding that next role? Was there a particular role you had in mind? Tell us how that went about and where you landed.
Yeah, again, it's still that non-traditional route because Eric, in my last 6 months in Asia, that the billionaire brought me over to begin with, actually took an interest and started the process of doing due diligence on the acquisition of Inter Milan in Serie A for Italian soccer. And so I spent my last 6 months in Asia jetting back and forth between Jakarta and Milan, assisting in that potential acquisition. Again, eye-opening, really seeing European football, global football, top 15 club in the world in Inter, tons of just history and tradition and fandom. My last name Macri is Italian by heritage. That's kind of a couple of generations removed from Ellis Island, functionally coming to the U.S. And so when I went over to Milan, I think it was my second trip. I don't think it was my first trip. It was still people didn't know Eric my first trip. The second trip, word had gotten out that this gentleman might be investing in whatever else,
Mm-hmm.
and that the deal could be close and that kind of thing. And I checked into my hotel. I handed them my passport. They started speaking to me in Italian, which I couldn't respond in, and that was fine. And they recognized that I was in Eric's block of room. And the next day, the Gazzetta dello Sport in Italy, my picture taken off of a website somewhere was the front page, and it said Macri to lead Tohir overtake of Inter, which none of those things were true. But for a day, I was apparently famous in Milan as the Italian American who Eric had tapped come in and do some work there. Again, not at all the case. I was doing backroom stuff, just figuring out like, hey, how many tickets did they sell, and how much sponsorship do they have right now? That's what I was doing. So.
This is my lack of knowledge, but is paparazzi is it Italian based? Is that like effectively you effectively get caught about it?
It must be, and it's funny. Like for that, I just walk around the city and you just realize, particularly for a club like Inter, that's so woven into the fabric. And either in Milan you are an AC person or you're an Inter person, and that's it. Like there is no, the few folks that are Juventus fans end up getting stoned, I think, at some point or another. So, Eric did complete that acquisition, and he knew I was ready to leave Asia, and he asked me, he said, "Would you go to Inter Milan? Would you consider taking on a role and being my person on the ground there?" And really thought about that hard. And at the same time, some folks that I knew in the ownership group for the Memphis Grizzlies gave me a call and said, "Anthony, look, we've reset our partnerships group. It's been in a bad spot. We know we need to do a lot of work here. Would you consider coming to Memphis?" And I think, I don't have, this is not verifiable, but I think I'm the only person in the history of the world who had a choice between Milan, Italy, and Memphis, Tennessee, and chose Memphis, Tennessee. I don't think anybody else made that choice. But I mean, functionally, I wanted to be back in the U.S. The family wanted to be in the U.S. And at one level, like I said before, I played and coached basketball through my younger life, and so being in the NBA had a kind of a pull for me. But more than any of those things, the role that Eric wanted me to do with Inter was more of like a marketing communications oversight role, working in their broadcast, Inter TV, some of these kind of initiatives, which was really interesting. But I like revenue. I like keeping score. I like going after deals. I like the structure of business development. And so, and really, the Grizzlies was the chance to reset an NBA team's commercial structure. And so, for those reasons, I did choose to come to Memphis, and the family's reunited. We came here and moved here now just about actually 10 years ago, almost to the day, we moved to Memphis. So, and I've been here for the last 10 years and really did walk into a situation in Memphis where it required a hard reset. They had a ton of partnership deals that were, for an NBA team, they had, when I walked in, about 120 partnership deals. That sounds like, oh, that's good, 120. It's terrible. It's way too many. And they were all small.
Because were they small and fragmented and lots of mom and pop businesses and local,
and some that were large businesses that were just spending at a level that was well below what they should be investing at. And and as you know, and I think folks that are in this business would recognize, when you're doing partnerships, the deal that's, I'm making up numbers, but a deal that's a small deal, and let's say in the NBA, a small deal is $50,000 a year, which is it's a small deal in the NBA. It's pretty small. The amount of effort that goes into managing that account is roughly the same in many cases as the amount of effort that goes into managing a $2 million account, because the share of the marketing budget that sponsor is spending, they're investing at 50,000 is a huge chunk of their overall marketing budget. And so they want, white glove service, even though their investment is not, really indicative of that. And so when I got into the Grizzlies, they had, like I said, about 120 deals. Average deal size was around $150,000, which is very low. And the vast majority, around 80% of the deals, were all one-year deals. So
Okay.
you're
So
constantly renewing these. It's just
you're in this tipping
cycle.
point of like always in renewal and always,
Yes.
again, trying to get them on board. So where was the focus initially? Because you can't just wipe the whiteboard clean and say, cool, let's start again. What was the process? Was it really to look at those should be bigger investors and start that conversation to say, well, you're putting in 200K, but really, you guys are a 500K, but you've got to take them on that journey because they've been paying, 200K year on year and not signed a multi-year. How did you start that conversation with some of what was the process that you went through?
Yeah. So two things, and I'll come to the conversation. But I think the first thing we had to do was make sure we had the right people on the bus, right? So, they had, when they hit the reset button, it was a genuine reset button. My predecessor left. 2 or 3 of the sellers that were on staff either saw the writing of the wall or were asked to leave and left themselves. The activation team had kind of drifted because they were not getting the kind of guidance that they needed to be successful. And so we were fortunate. I came into a situation where it was pretty much scratched. We had one mid-level seller and 2 junior-ish one mid-level and 1 junior activator, and that was the entire department. And in an MBA team, at that time, 10 years ago, we probably should have been at around 8 people, and they had 3. So we had a chance to really bring the right people in, identify the kind of talent we wanted to build it the right way, and then I had the opportunity to kind of impress upon that group how we're going to do it, the way that we're going to go into the marketplace. That was first of all just mission critical. The strategy is fine, but the right people, it doesn't matter what your strategy is. You got to have the right talent. So we're very fortunate. We brought in some really good people. One who ended up being with me the entire time and still there today actually came over from the ticket sales group where he led group ticket sales for the Memphis Grizzlies, but had always wanted to move into partnerships, but never really got the opportunity. I had 2 or 3 conversations with him and said, this is the guy. He's going to be great. And we moved him over. I had to teach him some things around how to think around partnerships. But he's been absolutely phenomenal. He's still great for the Grizzlies today. And brought in a few other people that really kind of made an immediate impact. And then in terms of strategy, I think you're right. Part of it is, and I advised the president who brought me in, the gentleman who hired me, Jason Wexler, is still the president there of the Grizzlies today. I told him in the first year, our first off season, I arrived in March roughly, is actually the very beginning of March. So in 15 days from now, it would have been 10 years. When I got there, even during my interview process, I told him, Jason, I'm letting you know, our first off season, we're going to end up losing some revenue. Don't panic. It's part of a process. We need to clean out some of these deals. And quite frankly, the good news ended up being, I told him, I said, I think this might happen. I can't guarantee it, but I think it's going to happen. Most of these bad deals, not all of them, but most of them, are ticket deals disguised as sponsorship. Yeah. So it was a seller in our department selling a sponsorship to a small company in town, basically really selling them season tickets, and then giving them a program ad, calling it sponsorship so they could collect a commission. And we said we're not doing this anymore. We have to have a set of principles that are going to guide the way that we go about the marketplace. We're going to build a rate card that's actually functioning and relates back to true market value based on what we see ourselves in competition with around the rest of the NBA. We're going to understand that our market in Memphis is the smallest market in the NBA, so we can't charge what the New York Knicks might charge in New York City. But we're at least going to be, relatively speaking, in ballparks together. We might be at in right field and they might be at home plate, but we're going to find a way to be close. And so thankfully we were able to kind of set it up where that was our pitch. And also thankfully, and I'll say this, I'm fortunate. I would say more than making great decisions, maybe I've made a couple of decent ones. I'm also very lucky. The Grizzlies were in the midst of a 7-year playoff run when I got there. And so
the grit and grind era.
Yes, exactly. Zach Randolph, Mike Conley, Marc Gasol, Tony Allen, they were at the top of the game, right? And so I came in at a time when there was a ton of excitement and engagement around the city. The team had a little bit of a mystique and an identity, which was really important for going out there and doing really good partnerships. And so, when we went into those conversations with the brand and said, guys, what you've been spending does not fit what the market should be for the kind of assets we're able to provide and the kind of value we're able to provide you. And I'll give you an example. We had a deal with Chick-fil-A that I inherited when I first got there, and it was like all the deals were, is a 1-year deal, so it was up at the end of the year. And we went to the folks, the franchise owners at Chick-fil-A, because you deal with the franchisees in the local market. You only have that 150-mile radius the NBA allows you to work in. And we talked to the franchisees, and we told them, look, the reality is that based on a pretty quantitative assessment, we're happy to show it to you. The deal that you have with the assets and benefits we're providing really should be $400,000 a year. But right now, your investment is $125,000, and we as a business cannot move forward with that deal structure. And I will be honest with you, they cried bloody murder. It was not a good conversation. They thought that we were gouging them, and it was outrageous, and they couldn't believe it. And we recognized there was probably some, like you said, residual, whether it be anger or frustration, or they've kind of gotten accustomed to this or whatever, and we held ground on it. We said we just cannot move. That doesn't mean that we don't want to do a deal. If we need to find a deal that fits that budget, we can, but it won't be with these assets. We have to scale back, and we're happy to work with you to find a kind of a step up resolution. But they said, no, this is outrageous, and we're walking away. 2 years later, they came back and said, we actually want to do a deal. We understand the value now, and we're ready to move forward. So sometimes you have to hold your value. And you've got to kind of make that case. And we did lose for our department in the first year between my when I arrived and the first year that I was there in full. We lost about $1.2 million in sponsorship revenue from our annual year over year, but $700,000 of that we retained in the ticket sales department, because they still sold those folks tickets. They just didn't get the program ad. And so it was really a loss for the company around $500,000. And Jason said, you're sure this is okay? I said, I promise it'll be okay. In the next year, I guess, so my first now full sales cycle where we're able to establish that strategy and move forward, we went up by $2.5 million. The next year, another $2.5 million, and kind of conceptually just started to build on that kind of structure moving forward.
So, I mean, that Chick-fil-A story is a really good one of that holding your value, and having those tough conversations and trying to reset things. That's in the deal making stage. But how important was that next 12 to 18 months in executing for the partners that said, yes, okay, Anthony, we're on board? Because that's why Chick-fil-A came back. They probably sat back and watched and went, holy hell, they're really doing a great job with all these partners. We want back in, Anthony was right, those values, and then you've exceeded. How important it was, activating, getting all of your, whether it be in stadium, in your program, across digital, and how important was getting that right, to back up your words?
Absolutely critical. I would say it's two things really ultimately that were the difference makers there. One, we made a concerted effort to focus our sponsorship, both our activation but our sales strategy around data and insights. And what we recognized, the Grizzlies really never had an insights function prior to us coming on board and prior to me getting there. Jason had just started. He'd only been with the Grizzlies for about 6 months when I was hired. And we brought in a dedicated resource to focus on insights for sponsorship. And that was a critical move because it put us in a position where we could talk about audience segmentation effectively. We could talk about, sponsorship effectiveness from the perspective of how it's actually achieving measurable results against a partner's objective. Those kind of things were absolutely critical. And that stuff spreads by word of mouth, where a brand says, hey, we're actually we know that this is actually working. Like it's not just that they like their name in lights, which they can and they do, but they also see it as having a measurable result, and in particular for a CMO or a mid-level marketing employee to take that to their CEO or their board and say, look, here was our objective, here's how we're measuring success, and we did it. That has huge ramifications in terms of their ability to invest further and to make further kind of commitments to us as a brand and otherwise. The second thing I would say that we did, and I think I'll give a lot of credit to the NBA, because I think more than any other league, the NBA does a phenomenal job of bringing the teams together to share with one another best practices and understanding of how to go about business. And I don't want to speak for international leagues. I only spent a little bit of time in Serie A. But in domestic leagues here in the United States, Major League Baseball teams hate one another. They won't work together. They don't share anything. NFL teams are like, they don't care, but it's more because they sign a $200 million check before the season starts. So, they're just fine. They're like happy-go-lucky. They win in spite of themselves. NBA teams have really figured out that we can help each other off the court, and on the court we can let the players really decide who's going to win in a competition. But off the court, us in Memphis, we really don't pose a threat to the Bucks in Milwaukee and vice versa. So if the Bucks have a good deal and we can learn from them, they're happy to share. And vice versa. We'll help them any plans we get. And so that was a spot where we really started to learn from other NBA teams how they were leveraging, in particular, social and digital to maximize partnership activation and give themselves a chance to really drive value for the partners. And we implemented that in Memphis among a number of other pieces that allowed us to have our activators and the folks on that activation team not simply check boxes on a contract, but become true marketing experts and stewards of the brand that they were working with. And that really goes a long way as well, because if the brand feels like they're not simply getting someone who's fulfilling a contract and checking off a box, but they're thinking about the brand actively and how can we help them to achieve this goal, and what's something, hey, we're doing this new activation that's not in your contract, but it helps to maximize what you're trying to get accomplished. Why don't we just do it? Like, that's just good customer service. And in our business, once you can maximize the value of an individual contract, the brand wants to come back. They don't want to go away. They want to stick around. So we were fortunate in being able to do that over the first few years, and it paid dividends certainly over those last few years.
I mean, I call it the Spice Girl strategy. Asking the sponsor what they want, what they really, really want, right? And if your commercial team knows what they actually want, then they can be brainstorming and figuring out an activation. And you're not the first person that's sort of spoken the praises of the NBA and the team marketing and business operations and how they bring everyone together. And I've had a lot of NBA folk on the podcast, and there is a lot of sharing because you have got that local market, border. Like you said, the Bucks can't be getting a sponsor in Memphis, so why compete? If it's working for Milwaukee or Detroit or Portland, how's it going to work for you? You're just going to put your own Memphis barbecue sauce over the top of it and say, hey, this is how we do it in Memphis. But there is a lot of sharing in the NBA, and I think that's one of the things that has helped a lot of people on the team side.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the learning that you get from an environment like that, the ability to understand how large markets are doing something that might be different from how we would do it in Memphis. And it should be. It's supposed to be different from how we do it. You've got to have a little bit of your own, not just style, but a structure that's going to work and given that environment. There are some choices we made around team structure in Memphis that I wouldn't make if I was in Chicago or LA. And likewise, if I was in Chicago or LA, what we did in Memphis wouldn't work. It just simply, I shouldn't say it wouldn't work. I don't think it would be optimized. And so we tried to find a structure and a process that really was optimized for Memphis, that allowed us to do our best work, and that gave us a chance to compete. We used to say this, it's a story I like to say about Golden State. Obviously, that period when we're talking about the height of grit and grind was also the kind of the ascendance of the Warriors dynasty.
Yep.
If you couldn't find a better confluence of factors than the rise of Silicon Valley, the entirety of San Francisco becoming this tech megalopolis, for the world, right there in San Francisco in the Bay Area, San Jose, and then a team that kind of embodied this new age way of playing that people loved on that West Coast. And so we used to say about the Warriors, nobody does more with more, because that's a team, they maximized every single thing they did on the business side while they were great on the basketball side. And while we were never, Memphis would never be confused with San Francisco, that would never ever happen. So we had to do as much as we could with less, and we tried to do that. And what worked in San Francisco wouldn't work in Memphis, but you still learn little pieces. Hey, that's what they did as an example in technology as a category, in San Francisco, where they broke it down into very, very particular subcategories in order to maximize the opportunity among all of these different tech companies there. We took that model and we said, look, technology is not going to be our bread and butter. Why don't we look into agricultural technology, where we can break down the agricultural? It's a breadbasket in Memphis. Like, I think something like 40% of the world's rice is out of like Arkansas and the greater kind of Mississippi Delta. So can we find ways to maximize this as a category? And you have to learn that way, and thankfully we're able to have some success doing so.
Yeah, most definitely. Like, the Warriors, and shout out to Kenny Lauer and Daniel Brusilewski, who've been on the pod, and Brew did a terrific job of taking all those tech partners and saying, how are you sliding into the Chase Center? And if you want to be in the Chase Center, you're also going to be a partner. And so it is getting all of those people to work together to make it right. And it's fascinating. I love the saying "steal with pride," like the fact that you took that tech hub partnership piece and go, "Oh, we're going to do it in agriculture in Memphis."
Yeah.
So that's that's your Memphis days, and you were there for nearly 10 years.
Yes.
And gone from an international role into a more hyper local role, in one of the big four leagues. You now joined the circus that is F1.
Yeah.
At Alpine as a commercial for the US. Tell us a little bit about how you got there and sort of what that role entails.
Yeah, so it obviously, again, it goes on that non-traditional journey. Didn't expect to be in motorsport ever. I grew up outside of New York City, and quite frankly, in the U.S. at that time, 30 years ago, it was a motorsport. People thought of NASCAR, maybe a little bit of IndyCar, predominantly a southeastern, predominantly rural, predominantly white, fan base. It was not really something that I ever had an interest in. In particular, cars going around in a circle, I just never really got into it, right? And so motorsport was never at the top of my list. It was never something that I had any real engagement with. But at the same time, when you're in sports business, you recognize over the last 5 or 6 years just the explosive growth of Formula One as an entity. Knowing back, seeing it 10 years ago, 8, 9 years ago, I saw the race in Singapore. I want to say it was either the first or second race when I was in Singapore or in Southeast Asia running the league. I was there for a race, and that was those Bernie Ecclestone days. It was still quite frankly hasn't changed that much from the wild west of sports business around the world. Never you perceive it as kind of having this cachet, this identity as wealthy and technology, but kind of it's the Monaco and these ideas like you don't know exactly what it is, and in particular when you're an American, you don't know what it is. And I had a friend who actually I'd worked with at the Grizzlies, who left the Grizzlies. It was actually not the friend, but a former boss of mine. He was our CRO for a few years at the Grizzlies, and he left the Grizzlies for an opportunity with Redbird Capital. Running One Team Partners, which you may or may not be familiar with. They owned group licensing rights for a number of the players' associations around the United States, including the NFLPA, I think the MLBPA, and a few others. And so he actually moved over to be the CRO for One Team, during our time at the Grizzlies. And they had a 3-year project and just killed it at One Team, absolutely crushed from a business perspective that opportunity. And they left that opportunity, exited as private equity does. They said, okay, we made our money. We'll move on and let that be on its own. And we're looking for the next thing. And he was part of looking for the next thing. And he called me at this point. It was a little bit over a year ago now, and said, hey, I can't tell you anything about it whatsoever, but we're looking at an investment that would involve a major property wanting to make sure that they've got a significant presence in the United States, major international property. I can't tell you anything more than that. And he asked me, he said, from a sponsorship perspective, as we're kind of doing some due diligence, what questions might you ask? And I said, I don't know. Like, it wasn't about a job. It was what questions might I ask? And he knew I'd had international experience, obviously the background on the sponsorship side. And I gave him a couple questions. So here's some things to think about. And he said, that's great, man. I'll let you know if anything kind of progresses. A couple months later, it was actually about a year ago now, he called me back and he said, okay, so I still can't tell you very many details, but the investment is with Formula One, and I can't tell you any more than that, but, any other questions you might ask? And I said, well, Formula One, I've got a few others that I would ask, and here's the way I would kind of structure those, and I gave him some of those thoughts. But again, it wasn't about an opportunity, it was just, he was picking my brain. It was just industry talk. Kind of like a nice little colleague-to-colleague kind of conversation. And about a month, a little bit more than a month, probably about 2 months later, so somewhere in that April timeframe, he said, okay, we're about to close this deal. He said, not close, but we're about to announce this deal. It's about to, kind of get our first paperwork. We're going to agree to a term. It's with this team. and it's Alpine. And he said, and honestly, like, we've talked about it, and we're going to need someone who can kind of be on the ground and help us with it. And would you be interested in looking at that? And honestly, I had not really at all been looking for an exit from the Grizzlies. We'd enjoyed our time there. I'd liked building things, and it's been a lot of fun. And the Grizzlies are getting ready to do a massive $500 million plus renovation of FedEx Forum and a variety of other pieces, renewing a naming rights deal with FedEx and et cetera, et cetera. So I had not really been looking, but I said, okay, you know what? We should have this conversation because, I mean, private equity involvement's interesting. The reality of a renewed investment is interesting. Formula One is exploding. I'm happy to have this conversation. And so we got to talking and recognized that, the reason that Redbird and Otro Capital, who actually led the investment, which was an offshoot of Redbird, the reason that they had made the primary investment is Alpine recognized, I think like many F1 teams, that F1 had been operating in a very much a closed loop. They were not thinking, they weren't taking best practices from other places. They were just kind of doing things. And they weren't focused on their commercial opportunities. They were focused on building fast race cars. But now that they instituted the cost cap over the last few years, teams were able to limit their expenses and still were driving as much, if not more, revenues with the advent of the Netflix series and otherwise, that these were really valuable entities. And Otro made an investment of roughly $200 million for 24%, something along those lines has been reported. And they, Alpine and Renault, as the owners, are looking for a return on that investment. So they wanted to restart the kind of commercial structure at Alpine in many ways, not unlike we had to restart the commercial structure at the Grizzlies when I got there 10 years ago. And so it was very much a similar kind of project with a completely different set of parameters because you're dealing with a global business and a different kind of dynamic. Ended up taking a few interviews and conversations with folks at Alpine. They were wonderfully gracious. They had already made a number of changes they knew they needed to make, but they knew they needed different kinds of expertise. And knowing why Renault renamed the team Alpine and what that was going to mean for the Alpine brand in the United States, they wanted a presence here. And so I was able to come in and help to lead business operations, commercial structure from a U.S. seat. I report into our global director of commercial, Dan Ritchie, who came over from Red Bull. He was the number 2 at Red Bull Racing, came over as the number 1 here on the commercial side for Alpine. And I run our U.S. office. And really, functionally with Dan, we run business development not just for the U.S. but globally. And it's been a wild 6 months because
I can imagine
the Wild Wild West is certainly true. It's still the case in Formula One, no doubt.
I mean, and the thing is, the US is still largely an untapped opportunity. Like, you've had Drive to Survive that has caused the explosion in interest and new fans, especially not just traditional motorsport fans. Women are now, following the F1 in large numbers, and you've gone from 1 GP to 2 GPs to 3 GPs. I was lucky enough to be in Vegas recently and checked out the F1 facility that, I was at the Pro Bowl last year. It wasn't there. I was at the Super Bowl this year. It was there. It was like they just dropped a cruise ship in the middle of Vegas and said, boom, here's a facility. So the opportunity in the US and the interest, is amazing. But then it's a very different proposition to a, 41 game schedule of an NBA, and selling suites, because it's this, global opportunity of you'll be in all of these markets and your logo, either it's on a patch on the driver or a logo on the car, and then all the content pieces. How have you been getting your head around like that different asset inventory and, how the F1 world works compared to, the NBA? You've gone from somewhere that's got rising tides lift all boats and everyone helping each other to a really cutthroat global world that is F1.
Well, you mentioned a few of the key differences that we've noticed. I think that one of the primary ones is, first of all, the inventory, there's actually a lot less inventory in Formula One than there is for an NBA team. Like we had pages and pages of inventory, with the Grizzlies. We have 2 or 3 pages of inventory from and it's not because we've got less than other teams. It's just because the vast majority of what the value comes from the IP rights. It's global IP rights. It's those kinds of of initiatives. And so you have the ability to kind of leverage it in many fewer partnerships. You're talking in the neighborhood of really 30 to 40 partnerships, really maximum. You're really not doing a lot more than that. But the value of those partnerships is more in it's multiples of what the NBA value is on a partner by partner basis. So that's one big difference. A second difference, certainly the global nature. I mean, it's easy to it's just the NBA is the most popular basketball league in the world, but outside of the U.S., the league controls most of the rights. The teams can do some things, but nowhere near the kind of flexibility that we would have. Another example in F1, the teams control their own licensing. In the NBA, licensing is largely controlled by the league. You can do a little bit, but you really can't do a lot. The league handles most of those kind of things. So, those things were big differences. I think another thing's a big difference is, as you mentioned, kind of the cutthroat nature of it. I haven't experienced it quite cutthroat, but certainly experienced the competition from a business perspective is much, much greater than it ever is in American sports, quite frankly. It's not just in the NBA. In the NBA, I would call a friend, and I have plenty of them still, from, you mentioned the Bucks or the Bulls or the Hornets or wherever, and say, hey, what are you thinking about this? How are you guys working on that? And I'd expect to have just a really open, transparent conversation. Here, you've got to kind of keep everything tight because all 10 teams are competing against each other for the same global sponsors. And so you've got to deliver a value proposition and differentiate yourself one to the other in very, very different ways. And that means that the competition actually means you can get involved in almost races to the bottom, where the brands put the teams in competition with one another, say, give us those assets, but at a lower price, or we're going with the team next door and next to you in the paddock. And I mean, you've got to make decisions about that. Never happened to me in the NBA. That would not happen.
And it makes that value conversation really tough. If they go, no, that's okay. We're just going to move 2 doors down to the car over there, and depending on how the teams are financially positioned, the appetite for the owner, or how their team is, or again, someone who's just a sponsor just wants to fill their book, like they just steal your sponsor because they go, oh, cool, we'll give you that for half. That doesn't really make it tough. There's that Wild West component.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think and this has been pretty good. Like the same playbook, quite frankly, to a certain degree, that we use to reset things in Memphis, we could use here. So one of the places that we feel like we've got an edge over the other F1 teams is our use of data. We've brought in some folks that understand how, in particular, U.S. companies assess sponsorship because that's what they've done. Because they've worked in American sports. And we've said, hey, how can we bring this level of intelligence and insights into our world and then communicate that back out to sponsors? Because the days, I think, they're not fully gone, but they're largely gone, of putting a CEO on a helicopter, flying him to a GP, putting him down in the paddock club, and then putting a contract in front of him at the end of the day. That just doesn't happen anymore, or at least very rarely does it happen. You now have, multiple shareholders within any brand that have to see it, and you've got compliance, and you've got all these kind of structures and regulations in place that, unless they're making a really good business case, you're not going to win the business. So, we've kind of, I guess, not just doubled down, but really focused on building effective business cases that we can demonstrate or show the brand that we can achieve measurable results against what they're trying to achieve. And, I don't want to speak for other F1 teams. We hear it more from both agents and from the brands themselves, that most of their conversations with other F1 teams, they have a conversation, maybe conversation. They tell them what their budget's going to be, and within 2 or 3 hours, they have a proposal on their desk. So it's really just the F1 teams are pulling it, that's our $3 million proposal. Just hand that out. We don't do any of that. Everything's customized. We're thinking about it the right, not the right way, but our way, from an insights perspective and driving value perspective. And in some cases, that's going to lose us some deals because the brand wants to move faster than we're able to move. But the deals that we win, we think are going to be pretty good ones, and we think we're going to have an opportunity to really grow those deals over time as well.
And it again comes down to execution, delivery, and having that data backing it up. I know you're early in the role, about 7 months now, but I'd love your opinion. Like, I think motorsport drivers are very different than most pro stick and ball athletes in that they really understand the commercial side, because most of them have grown up dragging their sponsors along and bringing a sponsor to their seat. Like, there's guys who've got seats in cars because they've brought the sponsors along. You've got some charismatic F1 drivers at Alpine, and Esteban and Pierre, and Aussie Jack Doohan is one of your reserve drivers.
Yeah.
How do you like leverage them and their both their social presence, what they can do in front of a camera for your partners, in what you can do with your partners in terms of whether it's advertising or appearances and activations?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. First of all, it was kind of really eye-opening. This is after I started with Alpine. I went to Monza. I was fortunate to be in Monza this year for the race there, and our hotel was the same one the Ferrari drivers were staying in. I didn't arrange that. I just got placed in that hotel, and so my room and the hotel was overlooking the lobby entrance to the hotel that we were in. And at 4:00 in the morning, you've got 1,000 people standing outside the gates of the hotel, hoping that that Charles Leclerc is going to like open his blinds or something. And these guys are, while we don't feel it as much in the U.S. because it's not as ingrained as it is around the world, particularly in Europe, they're megastars. And the way I would describe it is not dissimilar from LeBron when he would come to Memphis and people would be standing outside the hotel, 10 rows deep, just hoping to see him as he went from the door of the hotel to the bus to go to FedEx Forum. It's the same for each one of these guys. Regardless of whether it's Ferrari or Alpine or Mercedes or anywhere. And so you want to leverage that. I would say it's something that's 100% correct, and I couldn't agree with you more, Sean, that the support for sponsorship that's organization-wide is much, much more deeply felt in Formula One and in motorsport than it was in the NBA. In the NBA, media rights and ticket sales rule the roost. Sponsorship's a nice thing to do, and it gives us some extra revenue, but it's not like driving force commercially yet. I think it could be there in 10 years or so, because you can only fill so many seats in the stadium, and media rights are obviously going through flux. So sponsorship may end up becoming a bigger part of the pie in NBA teams. But right now, no one's making decisions based around that, or at least very few, maybe around when you do a renovation or something along those lines. But with Formula One, everyone recognizes, hey, we need that, because that's our only, or at least our primary form of self-generated revenue. We either have to succeed on the track in order to get a bigger share of the purse, or we need our sponsorships to come through. And so there's a deep organizational commitment that you don't necessarily see in a lot of American sports, and that's been, it's a responsibility, right? You have a large responsibility to try to fulfill that. And in terms of leveraging the drivers, because they're such big international megastars, that IP for Alpine also transitions to the drivers, whether it be, Pierre, Esteban, or Jack, or whomever, and trying to find ways to incorporate them with a partner, and they feel support, and they want to make sure that they're showing that support. So it's been a difference, a pretty big difference, but it's one that's like, it's a lot of fun. Like, it means you can be a lot more creative. In the NBA, you couldn't tie a player to anything unless there was a separate player endorsement deal, and you had to talk to their agent, and you couldn't negotiate it yourself. Here we can kind of do all of that. So we have a little bit more freedom to be able to find the right way to achieve that brand's objectives, whether it's using the driver or not.
And the other thing, also part of that, you talked about initial acquisition and that 24%. You've also got an influx of celebrities that are part of that, now part of the Alpine ownership group in, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney and Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. Again, it's another angle for you guys, and I thought it was really fun seeing Esteban geek out, meeting Ryan Reynolds and having the Deadpool helmet. Like, you as a sponsorship guy must go, like, that's manna from heaven. It's like the exposure you're getting, the conversations you're getting, and Ryan Reynolds at the moment sort of touches anything and it becomes gold. Yeah. How is it having some of those guys sort of be part of the group?
Well, it's great on, I think, a couple levels. One of the ways it's really been great is that these are not ambassadors or endorsers that we're paying. They've invested their money in this team. So they're co-invested in our success. We talked earlier in my time in Asia around aligning interests. Their interests and our interests are aligned. The better that we do, from a business perspective, their investment, the value of that investment grows, and that makes it it's a really positive thing from that perspective. So they're willing, and not just willing, but they're eager to find ways to help to support that investment. They can't do everything. They have their own sponsor commitments and their own other commitments that they need to make. But as an example, this past week going into the Super Bowl, obviously it's nice to have two Super Bowl winners on our on our ownership list. But we're going into the Super Bowl. I want to say it was Friday. I think it was Friday actually.
It was the whole week was a blur. I mean,
Yeah,
as someone who was there,
yeah.
didn't.
I don't know which week it did say. I was actually in the UK for our car launch, so I don't remember what day I was traveling. I have no idea where I was. And actually, now that I'm saying it out loud, I think it was Friday. But Travis elected, not with we didn't help him. He didn't plan for him. He didn't even tell us. He elected to wear an Alpine hat for his podcast that day, and then directly into the Super Bowl press conference, the pregame press conference, his personal pregame press conference. He's wearing an Alpine hat, and immediately it just kind of tore our world. Like whoa, this is like a big news story, right? And for us, it's tremendous engagement, it's tremendous building of fan base. It's great for our partners to feel like there's a in a time in Formula One, certainly Red Bull is just so dominant on the grid that we have to find other ways to win off the grid because we don't know how the car is going to perform. We've made a big bet on the car this year. We're hopeful that we're going to find some areas of opportunity for the car, but we can also win in other ways off the grid. If we can tell engaging stories, if we can use content meaningfully, all of that kind of thing, that's meaningful for our partners, and it's something that using our ambassadors and our investors to help us do, they're eager to do it, and we've been very fortunate to do so. And then the second piece that I would say has really been interesting, it goes back to what I said before. Renault renamed the team to Alpine a few years ago in anticipation of Alpine becoming a global car brand. And over the next 7 years, they're releasing 7 models of car, starting over these few years to start in the markets where they're already familiar. But by 27 and 28, they're going to have a massive U.S. car presence to rival Porsche and Tesla, from a sports car perspective. And so having those figures, our drivers, those investors, whomever else, supporting the growth of Alpine as a car brand has been massively important. And it's a big selling point for us when we talk to partners that, in order to grow in the U.S., Formula One is the tip of the spear from a marketing perspective to introducing people to the Alpine name. And we want brands that want to, reflect and reinforce that brand identity.
And I think, going back to that, your initial description of F1 as this mysterious, associated with princes and Monaco and, being that distant European sport, like you're bringing the, that US razzle dazzle and mystique with the Michael B. Jordans and the Travis Kelce's and the, Patrick Mahomes. Like they are the stars in the US, so it will absolutely help build the Alpine brand. And then, you're right, you're in the business of selling cars. So, like the success of Alpine and how it's portrayed, how Pierre and Esteban are portrayed in the next Netflix series, like it all flows into that revenue piece, which you said, that's the thing that gets you up out of bed in the morning. Like how do we keep the revenue model moving? And I think the F1 piece is fascinating when you compare it to the sports you've been in, where they all went down that more, hey, we're building our own media business, Grind City Media, and hey, that gives us more spots and dots and stuff like that. Whereas F1 is sort of only still getting into that, building out big social presence, but not website producers, not sending people back to a website. It's still a little bit behind, the NBAs, the NFLs of the world. Do you think that's something that you can see continuing to grow? Because that's what, a partner in the US will say, okay, Anthony, what are we getting? What are we getting from a social assets? What profile are we getting? Are you doing features? And that media capacity starting to build out?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think, you've got to find ways to engage fans that consume content, right? 99% of Alpine fans or F1 fans overall will never be at a GP. They'll never get there. They're consuming it via social, via digital, via other, certainly via broadcast. Now, F1 controls the broadcast. We understand that. That's completely fair and understandable. But we have an opportunity to show them something behind the scenes, to give them access to drivers and to provide them a little bit of that real touch via social and digital in their consumption of content, and we can produce that content. So I think, Ryan's interest in particular, and I don't want to speak for him, certainly would never presume to speak for Ryan Reynolds, but, what they're doing at Welcome to Wrexham, are we going to do the same thing in Alpine? I don't think so. I don't know. We'll see. But can we do something that works for us, given our environment? Yes, absolutely we can. And, I think we're going to start to see that. One of our first partners that we brought in when I started a few months ago was Mountain, a company that, Ryan is one of the founders of and one of the owners in, an early stage investor in. And so, we're excited to kind of have that conversation and glad that they're coming on board as a partner. And I'm sure they're going to leverage their relationship with Ryan to tell some really exciting brand stories.
That's true. Well, hopefully you do make your way down under, potentially maybe for the Grand Prix down here in my hometown. If you do, let me know. It's been a absolutely delightful conversation. I really enjoyed it. We've gone way too long, but as I tell people, if we're going long, it's interesting. So I really do appreciate it. So, Anthony, I want to get to the Sports Geek closing five.
Sure.
Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
So the first sports event, I'm not certain which one it was. I don't remember the game.
Sorry, we can't.
Exactly.
No one can check it on Google, so that's okay.
Yeah. So it was certainly my dad was a big New York Giants football fan, and we didn't have a lot of money growing up. And somehow someone gave him preseason tickets to a Giants game in the Meadowlands. And I remember going and it being, it was obviously in the middle of the summer because it's preseason in the NFL. So it was hot. And I remember going and sitting behind the goalpost and looking at the game and saying, man, this is a lot different than watching it on television. And I don't remember too much aside from that experience and it's kind of funny that it's an NFL game given my basketball history, but my dad's much more of a football fan than an American football fan than a basketball fan. So that was certainly the first experience. I don't remember what year it was, but it was somewhere in that range. And most likely, it was a Giants-Jets game. Almost certainly that would have been the game it would have been. That little New York derby.
Oh, that's a bit of a baptism of fire having those two teams fire up as a youngster. You would have been to a lot of sports events, whether it be in Asia or in Memphis. Do you have a favorite food memory at a sports event or a go-to food at a sports event?
Yeah, there's two things that I would cite. One is, and this might be more about the history and the mystique going back to it. Madison Square Garden as kind of like the mecca of basketball, right?
Yep.
The hot dog was probably not particularly good, but it didn't matter. It was still a hot dog at Madison Square Garden. So like going to whether it be the Big East tournament or a Knicks game or something like that, just has a resonance. But I would also point to, you talk about the best food. It's for right here in Memphis. Rendezvous, which is the barbecue partner for the Grizzlies. Very, very famous barbecue joint here in Memphis and sipped globally, actually. They're barbecue all over the world. Did the food at, I want to say maybe Harry and Meghan's rehearsal dinner, or maybe one of the other royal rehearsal dinners. Like they did something in there. But they do our barbecue, or did I? When I say our, they did FedEx Forum's barbecue when I was at the Grizzlies, and they have a barbecue nacho, which is a traditional nachos with melted cheese, barbecue sauce, and pulled pork, and it is great. Fantastic.
Well, it's 8 a.m. in the morning here in Melbourne as we record, and I would tuck into those right now. You had me at pulled pork. Memphis barbecue sounds amazing.
It is.
You're now back into international mode. So you've got people in Europe and you're managing US. What's the first app you open in the morning?
Actually, so it has changed. And before, when I was working in the U.S., the first app that I would open in the morning was typically like a news site or something, just kind of get myself updated. But because we have folks primarily in Paris and in London on our team, quite frankly, my email and WhatsApp are open almost immediately because as soon as I wake up, it's like, okay, I've missed the rest of the team has finished 6 hours of their day already. And I know something is gone right, gone wrong, or needs to be addressed. And so while that's probably not the most healthy for work-life balance all the time, as I'm kind of getting into it, that's probably been the thing that's happened and been a change. And I think that that's kind of dovetailed with most of my days now are really, I've gotten up earlier, I've worked earlier, and I finish my day earlier, because once I get to around now, no one's working over on the other side of the. I mean, they're going to bed, and so while I'm not fully on their schedule, I'm a little bit more on their schedule than I was before.
But it does give you that quiet time as well. When they all sort of have knock off, you're like, oh, cool, I can block off some stuff. And then also, I can do family stuff. I can go pick up my children from school and do some of those things. So it's actually a nice balance when you're reporting to another side of the world.
Yes.
Is there someone that either you follow, work with, or it might be an author or someone that you follow on social that the podcast listeners should follow and check out, and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually someone that you may have had on the pod before, and I just don't know for certain. But I don't know if you know Kim Skildum-Reid.
Yes, I do, and yes, Kim has been on the podcast before, and it's a terrific mention.
No surprise. So Kim, obviously an American from Minnesota now, living there and living there for 20 years at this point. I think it's been quite a while. Kim is quite frankly, I would count her as one of my mentors in this business. And my hope is that if folks had ever listened to her podcast or listen to her in different places, powersponsorship.com being her website, if they're ever doing that, you'll probably hear in a lot of the things I say are very much mirror images of what she would say, and so there are a lot of synergies between us, and we're hoping to get Kim out to London to do some training with our team later on this year, and really impart some of that wisdom and energy that she has with that group. And then the only other person I might mention just briefly is a guy. I'm not even sure if you can follow him really on social. But I would wholeheartedly recommend it for folks, sports or not. It's just really good. A guy named Chris Voss. Chris Voss wrote a book. The book is Never Split the Difference. Ostensibly, it's about negotiation. In reality, it's about human interaction. And it really, I think, helps us to understand how we can psychologically let the other side solve our problem. And that's it's been a tremendous resource for me as a masterclass as well. Well worth it to invest in that. The book is fantastic, and I'm a big believer in Chris and what he and that group over at Black Swan, which is his kind of his teaching group, have done.
Correct. Well, we'll drop the link to that book, Never Split the Difference, in the show notes. Lastly, and you can answer this professionally yourself and also from an Alpine point of view, what social media platform is your MVP?
So you know what? If you'd asked me this 6 months ago or so, it 100% would have been Twitter. On the person, I liked Twitter a great deal. It was kind of like the NBA platform of choice, following the action.
But there is that was in past tense. Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not the same now. It doesn't mean it's gone bad, but I used to have TweetDeck open constantly, and everything. But I just don't do it as much anymore. And quite frankly, I found myself, maybe interestingly, getting more and more into two now. But one more than other. LinkedIn has become, and this is certainly, it's a professional one, but I also find that, like, as my life has become more involved on the international side of things and being involved at a higher level of global sport, you just gravitate more toward that as a platform for both personal and professional reasons. And then the other one that I would just highlight, and I would say also personal and professional reasons, is I think YouTube has done and I don't know if people count it as a social network. I'm counting it.
No, I do. I count it. Yeah. I count it that way.
Yeah, it is. The amount of content certainly that's on there. The algorithm is remarkably good at directing you toward things that are actually relevant to your to what you're pursuing, what you're looking for. And you can find literally anything on there. So, obviously, like I said, I never came into motorsports, never into it. But using YouTube to understand the intricacies of Formula One as a technology, it's the best thing I think I've heard on YouTube. I stole, and you said about happy stealing or
Steal
whatever.
With pride.
Steal with pride. Is that Formula One is not a traditional sport. It's a science fair on steroids. That, to me, is a great way to describe it. And for an American audience that isn't as familiar with it, and they say, well, look, Max Verstappen's winning everything. Yeah, but it's not about Max Verstappen. It's about a team of 1,200 engineers versus 9 other teams of 1,200 engineers trying to build the fastest rocket ship that doesn't fly off into space. So, like that's a really compelling way to talk about it. And all of that language that I just said to you, I took from videos on YouTube to learn what F1 was. So, kind of remarkable, I guess. Those are the two I would highlight.
I would definitely, I count YouTube as a social platform, and it's completely underrated by sports mostly. I think it was last week. And I'll put the links in the show notes for this episode. Check out the 2024 State of YouTube report because it does detail both the growth, the massive growth in smart TVs. Like more people are, just open the YouTube app on their TV. Oh, what's it recommending me? Oh, now I'm watching, the Usher halftime show again. Oh, and now I'm watching, someone talking about F1 and their predictions. And now I'm seeing someone build a car. And again, once you start the rabbit hole, right, you probably just, 12 months ago, you started putting some F1 into your YouTube, and then, the algorithm is so good at delivering new things. So it's still, it's always been a funny relationship with sports because they sold all the sports rights. So they're like, well, we don't want to give it to YouTube. And it's like, yeah, but you're producing all this great content and, you can have more length. So I think YouTube is still, one, a terrific resource and, potentially will get back in the game of, what does sports rights look like? It's a player that's sitting in the background that might come along and just go chomp on a big sport and do more of it, like it has with, with the NFL. In the past 12 months, it's going to, if it's gone a bit down on the NFL, it's going to do it with other sports.
It would not surprise me terribly if over the next 7 months or so, when the NBA announces their new media rights partners, if YouTube and Google and YouTube are at, near the top of that list. I just, there has been a lot of ties between the NBA and Google over the last. They've presented the NBA Finals, I want to say, the last 3 or 4 years in a row.
Yeah, I think so.
I would be. It would. I take that back. It would surprise me if that was not the case. Now, I don't have inside information. I'm not making a prediction. You can't. Oh, everyone says Anthony put the futures on YouTube and the NBA. But if you took your magic 8 ball, signs point to yes would certainly come up on that magic 8 ball.
I completely agree with you. Anthony, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Like I said, I hope we can reconnect, whether it's you coming to Melbourne or potentially me sitting down for some Memphis barbecue in your part of the world. What is the best platform for people to reach out to you and say, hey, Anthony, I really enjoyed the podcast? Would that be LinkedIn?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is the best way to do it, and it's pretty easy to find. You can grab my LinkedIn. You may be able to put it in the show notes. People can certainly message me. Always open to talking to folks around the industry. Great to make connections, and happy to be a resource for folks. I've been very fortunate in my career to have some great mentors and networks, and always look to expand that and help folks by being a resource wherever I can.
Thanks again, mate.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and look forward to hopefully seeing you in Australia. We'll see how that goes.